The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Welcome back. We're ready to pick up in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13. In the last segment, we were looking at God's plan for the sisters when the church is assembled. Beginning in verse 13, Paul gives God's rationale for his command. Let's read verses 13 through 15. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Why is it that the Lord wants men to be the leaders in the assembly? Well, the first reason Paul gives is in verse 13, Adam was formed first, then Eve. We remember all the way back in Genesis where the Lord God formed man, that is Adam, out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. And it wasn't until later in the day, after Adam had had the animals paraded before him and had observed that he was by himself. It doesn't say anything about him being lonely. He'd never known anything different, but he did notice that he was alone. And God stated that it was not good that this state of things should remain this way. It was not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. And God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, drew out of his side a rib and apparently part of the flesh as well, and from that formed Eve. And Eve was brought to Adam, and Adam saw her, and he said, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." God made man first, however. Man and woman were both made on the same day, but God made Adam first. And in God's economy, primacy in order sometimes equals primacy in authority. For example, God came before man. God is the one in authority. Parents come before children. Parents are the ones in authority. And what John the Baptist said about Jesus is interesting. John 1:15, "He who is coming after me is preferred before me, for he was before me." We may not be able to understand that all the time. In fact, in human experience, we sometimes think of the first as being the failure. But in God's thinking, which we know is truth, whether we understand it or not, primacy in order, at least in this case, results in primacy in authority. So since Adam was made first, man is the one given authority. But Paul also says something else in verse 14. He says a second reason that man has been given authority in the church is that Adam was not the one who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Eve's deception is affirmed at least two other times in the Bible. She herself told the God in Genesis 3:13, "The serpent deceived me and I ate." And God never argued with that. She said, "I was tricked," and she ate as a result of that. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3, Paul said, "But I fear, lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ." Paul references that very same event. In what way was Eve deceived? Well, Satan assailed God's authority, God's accuracy, and the acceptability of what God had said. He led Eve to doubt that she could trust God. Did God really say that? Did you know that God's holding out on you? If you would eat it, you'll get to be like Him. He's holding out on you. He doesn't have your best interests at heart. And Satan continues to work that way today, by the way. One of Satan's greatest tools is to get people to not trust God. If he can succeed in that, then that's the path to destruction. He got Eve to believe something that was not true. And it seems only reasonable to suppose that Satan did not choose arbitrarily. He had two human beings walking the planet to choose from, and he chose Eve. It has been said that in general, a man's center of action is his mind and a woman's her heart. It's a general statement, but I think there is some truth to it, and that may have had something to do with Satan's choice. One thing that is for sure is our strengths are our weaknesses. I was told that many, many years ago, and I've never forgotten it, and I've only come to believe its truth more and more as the years go by. In general, I believe and have found that women are less inclined to go against what they truly believe. If a woman believes a certain course of action is the right course of action, she is more likely to follow through on that sometimes than men are. I would venture to say that there are more willful male sinners than there are willful female sinners. That's the other side of this coin. When Eve sinned, she sinned, and it wasn't right, but she believed she was doing something that was good. Adam knew good and well that what he was doing was not good. And so his sin was more egregious, as God makes a distinction between sins committed in ignorance and without understanding versus sins committed willfully. None are okay, but one does seem to be worse than the other. Whatever the case, Eve was deceived. She was taken in. When she tells God that the serpent deceived her, God doesn't argue with her assessment. Eve apparently believed that the fruit would help her, that it would make her wise, that God would not fulfill His threat of death. But of course she was mistaken. And because of this decision on her part and this reality, man's role as leader was affirmed and perhaps augmented. So this brings us to an important place. A Christian woman might be reading this, watching this video right now, and begin to wonder just what is her place in the Lord's church. I am the father of 5 daughters, and I want my daughters to know that they have a very important place in the Lord's church, and it's no less important a place than the place my sons, God permitting, will hold someday. What's going on here? Well, there is much to do. There is work on every hand. There is work that God has for brothers and sisters alike. It's not that God doesn't want sisters involved in the work of the kingdom at all. It's that He just has different work for them. And so, in verse 15, to help the sisters see what is their role, at least one of their roles, Paul says, nevertheless, even though the sister's role is not a public one in the assembly, even though the statement about Eve is true, nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. I'd like to read to you this verse from some other translations. The New American Standard reads as follows: "But women shall be preserved through the bearing of children, if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint." The ESV, "Yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control." The NIV reads, "But women will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety." Notice that 2 of those translations chose to render the she as women. They are doing what we sometimes call dynamic translating. They're doing a little bit of interpreting for us, although I think they are accurate, and we'll get to that momentarily. I think the thing about this passage that can trouble us more than anything else is this word saved. Nevertheless, she shall be saved in childbearing. What does Paul mean when he says saved? Well, this is the same Greek word that's used to speak of being saved from sin. Although that's not the only thing this word is used to mean in the Bible. Without being tedious, in Matthew 8:25, this very same word is used to speak of being saved from danger. In Luke 23:35, it's used of being saved from death. In Matthew 9:22, it's used of being saved from sickness. And in Jude verse 5, it's used of being saved from affliction. So this word can mean being delivered or rescued or preserved from various kinds of danger or threats, physical and spiritual. How is it intended here, however? I think this is the hardest verse in the chapter and probably the hardest verse in the book. I'll offer you what I think it may mean. By she, I think the most likely explanation is Paul did mean women in general, as the NIV and the New American Standard chose to explain it. Paul has just been talking about Eve's sin. And just as the consequence of Adam's sin rests upon all men, we labor by the sweat of our brow, so also the consequence of Eve's sin rests upon all women, sorrow and childbirth. So having just referenced Eve's sin, Paul now turns his attention to the entire gender who bear the curse that resulted from that sin. And he says that she, that is women, shall be saved in childbearing or through childbearing. I do believe that when Paul says saved here, he is talking about our soul's salvation. But how can Paul say that a woman is saved through childbearing? How do we make sense of that? Well, let's just for a moment remember how that as we go through the entire Bible and the Old and New Testament alike, what a glory it was for a woman to have children. Women who were able to have children blessed the Lord. Women who were not able to have children were very sad about it and rejoiced when it was finally made a possibility. God in the book of Psalms describes having children as a reward and a great blessing to the family. So this is God's view of childbearing. And Paul says women shall be saved. In other words, having children will play a role in their salvation. Now, before I go very far, we need to answer some things. And I thought how to go about this. And I've just decided to read to you something I wrote several months ago. A sister wrote me asking about this passage. And I'd like to read to you what I wrote, because this encapsulates what I believe better than anything else I have at my disposal. It's 3 paragraphs, but these are my beliefs about 1 Timothy 2:15. It seems that Paul is making a general declaration about the role women are to play in the kingdom. And the key word is general. Just as the command to ask their own husbands at home in 1 Corinthians 14:35 cannot be literally obeyed by all women, since all don't have husbands, 1 Timothy 2:15 declares a truth that applies to most Christian women. There will be some sisters who don't have children because they can't, and others who don't because they have chosen to live a single life for the kingdom of heaven's sake or have not been able to find a good Christian man, which is getting harder and harder as the days go by. 1 Timothy 15 should not distress sisters in these categories. In verses 11 and 12, Paul stated that a woman's role is not public. That is, it is not her responsibility to teach in the church. That responsibility is given to men, those who have the gift, Romans 12:6 and 7, and by fulfilling that responsibility, those men will please God and meet one of the conditions of their salvation. The reasons that responsibility is given to men are provided in verses 13 and 14. A godly woman might read what Paul has to say up to that point, as we've been discussing, and begin to feel demoralized or marginalized. She might ask, do I have anything to offer? Has Eve's sin just confined me to the role of baggage? What can I do? 1 Timothy 2:15 is the answer. To the woman, God has given the blessing and enormous responsibility of the domestic sphere, the bearing and rearing of children. It was Napoleon who said, "The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world." By fulfilling this role, as well as continuing to practice the godly attributes of faith, love, and holiness with self-control, Christian women, the exceptions are understood, will please their Lord and thereby meet one of the conditions of their salvation. As you study this passage, I would encourage taking a look at 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 9 and 10, and 13 and 14. God places tremendous value on the bearing and rearing of children. For sisters who are not able to or choose not to live a single life in service to God, or who are for other reasons unable to do otherwise, it's a different matter. But in general, this is one of the powerful things that a woman is able to bring to her service to God. Something a man could never do. And something that is scorned by the world. But we need to let God be our guide. And it's something that brings glory to a woman. And I speak that as a man who is blessed to be married to a woman who has brought 8 children into the world. and is working with them diligently to hopefully make them or help them be the servants of God we all hope they will be. The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, and it has a powerful influence on the church for years to come. We're now ready to turn our attention to 1 Timothy chapter 3. And 1 Timothy chapter 3 is a part of this book that many of you watching this video may be a little more familiar with, as it is the part of the book that contains the qualifications for elders and deacons. We're not going to be able to get terribly far in this particular segment in this third chapter, but let's get it started. This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous. One who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. He begins chapter 3 with, "This is a faithful saying." In other words, what I'm about to say is a faithful, a trustworthy saying. It's the second faithful saying of the book. The first one we read in chapter 1, verse 15. And the faithful saying is that if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. Now, the expression position of a bishop or office of a bishop is actually a translation of a single Greek word that actually means engagement in oversight or supervision. Maybe I'm getting down in the weeds a little bit here, but what Paul is literally asking is anyone who desires to oversee, he desires a good work. Now, the work of overseeing the church is the work of an elder, even though the word elder does not appear in 1 Timothy chapter 3. And we know that by making a careful comparison between 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1. Here in 1 Timothy 3, as soon as he talks about overseeing, he says in verse 2, "A bishop then must be." So the one who oversees the church is a bishop, and here are what his qualifications are. Now, if we go to Titus chapter 1, we find a list that is almost identical to this list in 1 Timothy 5. And there we find the word elder. In Titus chapter 1, verse 5, Paul tells Titus, "I left you in Crete so that you could appoint elders in every city." And then in verse 6, Paul starts to tell Timothy what the qualifications of an elder are. And then it says in verse 7, "For a bishop must be." In other words, telling us that bishop is another name for an elder. Now, this shouldn't strike us as too strange because we do the same thing in our own language and culture. The President of the United States is also sometimes known as the Commander-in-Chief. The two are speaking of the exact same man, but they're two different names because they speak to different aspects of the office. And so it is with bishop and elder. Bishop speaks to the work of overseeing the flock. Elder speaks more to the age and gravity of the individual. This parallelism between elder and bishop is evident elsewhere in the Bible. Acts chapter 20, verse 17, we read that Paul called for the elders of the church at Ephesus. He called for the elders. But then while speaking to the elders, in Acts 20, verse 28, he says to them, "The Holy Spirit has made you overseers." The Greek word is the word for bishop, the exact same word that we have back in 1 Timothy 3:2 and in Titus chapter 1, verse 7. He called for the elders, but then he tells them the Holy Spirit has made you bishops. He's made you overseers. It's one and the same. We see it again in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Peter writes to the elders, but then he says you're to be serving as overseers. That is in the Greek, you're to be serving as bishops. This is a well-known connection. It was even recognized and referenced by Edward Gibbon in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And Edward Gibbon was not a believer. This is not esoteric, real technical stuff that only a few of us are able to see. This is generally well understood, that a bishop and an elder are two names for the exact same office. A man who desires to serve in this office desires a good work, says Paul. It is not inappropriate at all for a Christian man to desire the work of an elder. It's entirely appropriate for a godly man to say in his younger years, or even as he grows and becomes older, to say, "Here am I, send me." Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8. It's entirely appropriate if he desires the service and not the status. It's entirely appropriate if he has a mind to work. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6, because the work of a bishop, the work of an elder is just that. It is work if it is done right. Shepherding the Lord's people is not for a lover of pleasure. It is not for a lover of idleness. It is not for a man who's desired to live his latter days in retired bliss. It's time-consuming, it's tiring, it's trying, it's going to keep you up at night, as one elder said. He tossed and turned on it all night rather than sleeping on it all night when he was dealing with an issue as an elder. The church desperately needs, as of 2018 here in the United States, desperately needs overseers of the Lord's flock who are ready to sacrifice and pour their lives into this work and do not have the attitude that the shepherds of Israel had in Ezekiel's day, Ezekiel 34, 1 through 6. So if a man desires this work, is that enough to qualify him for it? Absolutely not. Paul lists qualifications. If we were to take the list in 1 Timothy 3, Titus chapter 1, and the one Peter provides in the first few verses of 1 Peter chapter 5, we would find that there are 24 qualifications that a prospective elder must meet. However, we're studying the book of 1 Timothy, so we're going to confine our study to the 16 or 17, depending on whether or not you count the desire as a qualification. We're going to confine our study to these. So, let's begin. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, a bishop, an elder, must be blameless. This qualification is stated also in Titus chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Although Paul uses a different word when he writes to Titus, the words mean the same thing. Irreproachable. A man to serve as an elder does not need to be perfect. He does not need to live a flawless life. He is a human being. But there must be nothing in his life that is open to censure. If the world can find something against him that will stick, it will have to be something, as with Daniel, concerning his religion. Remember what those who had it out for Daniel said. Daniel chapter 6, verse 5, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." This man lives a good life. Sure, he makes mistakes, but we can't find anything that impugns his character. What we're going to have to do is twist things and make something out of his service to God. That's the kind of man we need for an elder. Character is just as important as competence. Secondly, Paul says in chapter 3, verse 2, that a bishop must be the husband of one wife. Mios gunaikos andra in the Greek. Literally, a one-woman man. This is a fatal blow to the Roman Catholic Church's policy of celibacy for its bishops. I was talking with a man from the Roman Catholic Church a few years ago and was telling him how I have to try to strike a balance between my work as an evangelist and my life as a husband and a father. And he remarked to me, not knowing much of what the Bible says, he said, "Well, that's why in the Catholic Church we have church work done by men who are not married." And of course, what he was saying reflected a misunderstanding of what the Bible says. Anyone who would serve as a bishop, as an overseer, as an elder, must be, says the Scripture, the husband of one wife. So let's break that down. He, first of all, must be a man. He's to be a husband of one wife. This requires him to be a man. It means he cannot be a polygamist. That is, he cannot have more than one wife. Polygamy is illegal, at least for the most part, here in the United States as of 2018. And polygamy may not have been very common in the first century Roman Empire either, but this was written for all people for all time. I was in West Africa in the year 2000 with Brother Charles Fry, and meeting with the saints in that country, we encountered some things we wouldn't encounter here. The Muslim religion had quite a following in certain parts of Ghana, And some of those Muslim men were converting to the faith of Christ. And when they were converted, they brought with them their multiple wives. And the church had to make a decision how to handle this, and unfortunately there were some divides taking place over how it should be handled. But there was a culture that was allowing for polygamy. This qualification does not allow for a polygamist to serve as an elder. This qualification also would disallow concubines, which are simply lesser wives. Men share a bed with them. No man having concubines could serve as an elder. I do believe it allows for a remarried widower. Somebody once said to me 23 years ago, there's no such thing as specter spouses. In other words, when a man's spouse dies, she's no longer his spouse. Jesus made this very clear when talking to the Sadducees in Matthew 22. The Sadducees, of course, did not believe in the afterlife, and they had a very elaborate argument that they liked to put forth to show just how silly those who believed in an afterlife were. And so they brought it to Jesus. They said a woman was married to a man and her husband died, and according to the law of Moses, that meant his brother was to marry her and raise up offspring to him. Well, he died and so on until she'd been married to 7 men, and they all died. Well, in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? Because she was married to all 7. And they thought this a pretty powerful argument, but their argument was based on an assumption. And that assumption was that just because somebody was married here on earth, it meant they would be married after they were brought back to life. And Jesus said in Matthew 22, 29 through 30, "You are mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. Not only will there not be new marriages, but the marriages that took place here on earth will no longer be marriages in heaven." So when someone passes from this life, the marriage passes with them. If a man was married and his wife has passed away, he was the husband of one wife while she was living. Once she's passed away, he's no longer a husband at all. It was until death do us part. But if he remarries, he is once again the husband of one wife. Some have taken Paul's description of a husband of one wife here to mean that Paul was saying a man can only have been married once. I think that is a misunderstanding of this passage. And I've got a couple of reasons for that. One is if we were to go to the 5th chapter of 1 Timothy and look at verse 9, we would find that a widow, in order to be taken into the number, in order to be one who is supported full-time by the church, one of the qualifications she had to have met was that she must have been the wife of one husband. This is a reverse of what's said about a man. Literally, it means she had to have been a one-man woman. Now, if that means she was only to have been married once, then that would have put Paul in a rather odd situation later in the chapter, because later in the chapter in 1 Timothy 5, he encourages the younger widows who were young when their husband died to remarry. If being a one-man woman means a widow could only have been married once, then Paul was commanding the younger widows to do something that would automatically disqualify them from receiving the church's help in the future, which doesn't seem like that would be something the Holy Spirit would inspire Paul to do. I therefore understand Paul to be saying that a man who would be appointed to the eldership must be married to a single woman, and he must be married to her at the time of being appointed. Now, there's one more question to answer about this. What about a divorced man? That's the hardest question related to this qualification, I think. And my answer is this. Provided that his divorce was for adultery, per Jesus' command in Matthew 19, provided that his divorce was for adultery, I am open to the possibility that he is qualified, that he is the husband of one wife. Although I must confess, as of this point in my life, I'm uncertain enough about that I could not conscientiously appoint a man in that situation. That's my judgment. If a congregation was considering appointing such a man, it should be considered and considered with great seriousness that any man appointed to the eldership must also, chapter 3, verse 7, have a good testimony. In other words, he must have a good reputation. And any divorced man may be a man whose testimony, among others, has been compromised, whether justly or unjustly. So that brings us to temperate or vigilant in your King James, and we'll plan to pick up with that qualification in the next segment. Hope you can join us then.